Phone がにかかっているみたいかい越しのせい愛されの東京だ君の目が覚めたら変わらないよ東京だ君と手をつないだら変わらないよ
This isn't cultural appropriation when you talk about like the spread of Buddhism from South Asia all the way to Japan and beyond. Like it's just a series of like cultural interactions that result in like the spread of a religion or ideology and like the local adaptation of that sort of vocabulary and culture. And it's expressed in very different and beautiful ways. And like this happened over thousands of years out of more benevolent interactions and encounters and coexistence. Words describing like Western institutions and stuff like that, and for the most part, were created in Japan in the late 1800s, and then moved back to like Korea and China once those countries went over their own like domestic processes of like democratization and like stuff like that. Philosophy, for example, it's the same word in Chinese and Korean and in Japanese, but the Japanese were the ones that created that combination to begin with, and then it spread back. Because most of the like words in the Chinese words came from China or Korea to Japan.
I always thought about like the natural flow of like the process of creating words going from China to the rest of the world, China to Korea, China to Japan, China to Vietnam, and not the other way around. Is it still the same characters?
The exact same characters.
Same characters, just different pronunciation.
Yeah, but it's the exact same thing. Like they call it the Junyomi is like the Chinese pronunciation of the characters. This onyomi is like Japan never created an alphabet to like talk about their own things. So from the beginning, they were just like they had their own language, heavily influenced from Chinese culture and Korean culture, and then they had no way to write it. So they wrote everything in characters. You know, like that doesn't make sense when the grammar is completely different and the like descriptive vocabulary is very different. So like that's why like one like in contrast to like Chinese or like Cantonese and like Korean, one character in Japanese can have like anywhere from 1 to 5 pronunciations, because there's the original like Japanese native pronunciation that they like transposed onto a character, and then there's also like 3 or 4 different waves of when different peoples from like Chinese cultures or like Chinese literary culture from Korea came to Japan, and instead of just like coming up with one pronunciation at different periods in history, they like Japanicized, sort of like the katakana, like tekira, sunrise. They did the same shit to like the kanji from like whether it was Nanjing or Guangdong or Seoul, you know, and more likely Busan, right? So, like I had no idea, especially like literally none of this would have happened if I didn't fucking become addicted to caffeine and like start working in the coffee shop, right? I didn't actually ever study this stuff. It's sort of just like I learned Korean randomly, and then I ended up in China and learned Mandarin because my mom. Like, oh, like I start to see all these like weird similarities between like Mandarin and Korean, and in a very perverse way, the unifying like Orientalist view of the West, like oh, fucking you're all Chinese, in a very perverted way, the nuanced perspective, actually like there is truth in it. And that's like the most like fucked up part. Like to some degree it actually is true. Like not to talk about like cultures or like ethnicities, but like the language that they actually speak, like to a range of 50 to 60%, it actually is all Chinese. If it weren't for the development of hunger, whatever, 600 years ago, the King Sejong or whatever created hunger, and instead of writing all the characters in the characters, they just wrote them in letters, right? But behind those letters exists the same Chinese characters. Yeah. So like Juanbei, in Korean Chundi, in Japanese Jundi, but it's all exactly the same characters. The reason why like you'd understand it in Japan is because they still use them.
That's what was so mind-blowing to me about like Southeast Asia, like Indonesia and Thailand, especially Thailand. Like Thailand is like the one Asian country that's never been colonized before. So like they still retain that like culture of like in Thailand it's not taboo to be like trans, or that's why like where everybody goes to get the like gender corrective surgery. But like in Thailand, they're very like unapologetically themselves, right? Because they've never been subjected to this sort of like Western perspective of like Christianity or like all of these like other religions. Like trans culture isn't taboo. You go to like temples and like there's pictures of like the architect like pointing middle fingers at you all around the temple, and it's like this is just part of the aesthetic. There isn't some sort of like unifying like correct way of like some central dogma of religion.
But as China is to Japan and Korea, as India is to Thailand, there's a lot of that, even in the language today. The Thai also has an alphabet, but it comes from South Asia. And it doesn't look like Hindi right now because in South Asia, the alphabet's Devanagari is technically called like a visual. It's not quite an alphabet, but it's effectively the same thing.
It's got the curves.
It's effectively the same thing. There's letters, but each letter has like an inherent sound in it. So it's like not A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it's forget the vowels, B, C, D, it's like ba, ka, da. And then you add something to it to change the vowel. And in North India, it developed in one way, and then at a certain breaking point, like 2,000 years ago, the South Indian languages, which are like completely different language family, also adopted the North Indian writing system and adapted it in their own ways. But it's the same base system, like it works the same way. It just looks a little bit different. And from South India, actually, the Hindus went to Southeast Asia. So right now, like Burma, Thailand, and I don't know where else, Cambodia as well. The scripts all derive from South Asian scripts. And so like in Thai today, there are like a lot of random letters that are it's like having a C and a K, but they're only pronounced like K. And just because of the history, you write it a certain way that like doesn't necessarily make sense, but it used to, because originally in like South Asian languages, those are things that are pronounced differently. Because there's like ka, ka, right? But they both sound like ka to someone that doesn't have a distinction between like the aspirated and unaspirated like K sound. So like there's like random letters that like are functionally like useless in Thai, but they still use because of the history of like cultural and religious and literary migration from South Asia and Southeast Asia.
I feel like if anything, I would assume that you were like a linguistics major more so than like international relations.
It's just out of random interest. Like I've never studied this shit. I took one linguistics course total during my years in college, and it was about much less interesting things. It's about like phonetics and stuff.
The parallels between Thai and
just because I like learning languages and because I like history. He died in India, and that's why the Indians claim that he's from India. But at the time, there was no Nepal and no India, right? It was just like random princely states in South Asia.
Right.
But anyways, so Buddhism started in South Asia, and then it moved first to Southeast Asia, and then almost at the same time, northwards through Tibet, through China or whatever kingdom at the time, whatever empire, and then down through the Korean peninsula and then into Japan. And along the way, like there eventually were like 3 different like schools of like Buddhist thought, but it all comes from like South Asia. And even now, like you go to a Japanese Buddhist temple or like a Korean Buddhist temple, and the prayers and the things that people say, no one knows what the fuck they're saying because it's not Korean and it's not Japanese. It's
all derived from
Korean, Japanese pronounced Chinese translations of Sanskrit. So like the Chinese did the exact same thing as like the Japanese katakana being like Hira sunrise. They did the same thing with like Om Nama Jai Bhagwan in Sanskrit like prayers. Like they just pronounced it in like their phonetic system, and then the Koreans tried to pronounce that in the Korean phonetics, and the Japanese did the same. But like so like if you go to a temple in Japan and you hear a traditional like Buddhist thing, a normal Japanese person has no fucking clue what they're saying.
Okay, I got explains so much because also like that's the
And they don't
case.
even know the characters. Those characters were ones that they created to represent ideas and shit in like South Asian Buddhist culture.
So this is just like systemic cultural appropriation.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, cultural appropriation hasn't become a problem until,
Recently.
and it's not a problem in Europe. It's a fundamentally recent phenomenon of America because of their own contested and contentious history of like fucked up racial relations. Not to say that the parochial fucking backwards continent that is Europe doesn't have the same problems in a different accent, but because of America's like unique fucked up history, those things are much more salient in the national conversation. No one talked about cultural appropriation when Elvis was stealing from black people. It was the same phenomenon. And I mean, there's a thing when it's like no one is, like, has wicked intentions, even if like your minority status is a subalternate group in the mainstream American culture. It comes out of a place of, the privileged class being intrigued at best, at worst, stereotyped and, orientalized or whatever. And I think that only in America has it become such of a problem because of its own particularly history. Whereas America is 300 years of like direct, whether it's slavery or other very fucked up forms of discrimination, oppression, and now like institutionalized racism and other problems. But a continuous compressed history of a lot of violence. Whereas like, this isn't cultural appropriation when you talk about like the spread of Buddhism from South Asia all the way to Japan and beyond. Like, it's just a series of like cultural interactions that result in like the spread of a religion or ideology and like the local adaptation of that sort of vocabulary and culture. And it's expressed in very different and beautiful ways. And like, this happened over thousands of years out of more benevolent interactions and encounters and coexistence